Hello again, friends. This is Mike with another podcast here today. I'm going to discuss a couple things that came to mind during this recent Easter Sunday. Stand by. Hello again, friends and fellow truth seekers. Mike Nicholas here with another episode of the Soul Unleashed podcast, where my goal is to help you with the questions you might have regarding the awakening of your soul, and particularly to help other left brain types, like I think I am, ask the right questions in our search for deeper meaning to life. Ultimately, I want to help you unleash your soul from limiting beliefs and smothering paradigms. Let's get started with today's discussion. I usually try and talk about something that has happened recently, and I wasn't actually at Mass. I was watching Mass on a computer with my wife. She's still in the hospital and everything. And although I'm going through this spiritual awakening kind of thing in the Soul Unleashed process, she is in a different place spiritually, and so it's important to her still to attend Mass. And I've always said in this podcast that I'm not critical of organized religion. I think that there's a place for that. I think that it's very important in people's lives that they have something that they can belong to and a way to do good, if you will. And I hate to say it, but the longer I've been around this, I guess you would call it, I wouldn't call it New Age, I guess so much, but thinking things that maybe are not necessarily biblical or are not necessarily found in Catholic doctrine. The more I've been around people that believe those things that have moved away from the church, I find a lot of them to be, individuals or lonely. They don't belong to any specific faith group. And so I think there's a lot of good that exists out there. Even though I don't necessarily believe things that I used to believe, I still go to Mass occasionally, and I attend Mass with my wife. Using an iPad from her bed, I attend Mass with her because it's important to her, and I want to be with her to do that. But anyways, here's what happened. I was listening to the Mass. It's a church nowhere near where we are, and the priest, we like this particular priest. He's usually very funny and humorous. He's from Poland and speaks with a Polish accent, and he said something that really made me stop and think. He said, as part of his homily, he said, the church is not, meaning the Catholic Church, because he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he said the church is not the Vatican. The church is not controlled by the Vatican. The church is not controlled by the Pope. The church is not controlled by the bishops. The church is not controlled by the priest. The church is you and your relationship with Jesus Christ. And he was making that point on Easter Sunday, and I thought, wait a minute, that's exactly the opposite of what I've always was taught to believe, and exactly the opposite of what I think church doctrine has always been. And I've also mentioned on this podcast, I'm going through this course because I want to learn more and understand more. And the course is about the church fathers and a lot of the writings that they did. So this thing about you can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and not need the church is exactly what the Protestant Reformation was about. One of the things, the Protestant Reformation had problems with some other things like, paying for indulgences, but mainly they had a problem with the church hierarchy. That there's no place in the Bible where it talks about the need for a pope, and the church, of course, by the time Martin Luther King and the Protestant Reformation happened in the 1600s, the church was well into a lot of things which are pretty shady and considered nowadays to be not the best time for the Catholic Church, right? They were doing a lot of things that were political. Bishops were appointed because of their politics. There were different popes that were appointed because of their politics and what they could do, and popes were very much involved in the political orchestrations of the day. So anyway, those things are the kind of things that Martin Luther King definitely objected to. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King. I'm not going to take that out because it's kind of funny. But anyway, Martin Luther objected to these things. And so the authority of the Pope was one thing that Protestants, or the people that became Protestants, objected to. The moral failings and corruption within the clergy, some of the political stuff that was going on. They also objected to clerical celibacy, which, to me, I don't really care about that. But the role and selection of bishops, that it was done on a very political basis, and that there was no hierarchy described in the Bible. There was no lack of scriptural basis for a hierarchy. And so they sought to change a lot of this. But one of the biggest things that the reformers thought about and proclaimed was that you didn't need someone to interpret the Bible for you. You didn't need an intermediary to go between you and God. And of course, the Catholic Church was all about intermediaries and the hierarchy that was involved. And so I thought, well, to hear a priest say that, maybe nowadays, I just don't think that's the way the church current doctrine is either. But to say we don't need the Vatican or the Pope or any of that stuff to go directly to Jesus Christ, it was refreshing to hear that, but I don't think that's the current thinking. So anyway, I went back to my class and a little bit about some of the early church fathers that I was reading. And one of them, which was very interesting, was Saint Ignatius of Antioch. Now, Saint Ignatius was, this was back in the first century, so the church had been around for less than 100 years. And many of the people that were writing about this time, they knew Jesus Christ, or that they knew the apostles who knew Jesus Christ. And St. Ignatius was basically being taken by the Romans from someplace in Turkey to Antioch to be crucified, or he was eaten by wild beasts in the Colosseum in Rome. But anyway, he's on this ship, and while he's traveling, the Romans are, actually just taking their time. It took them a long time, months, to get from Antioch to Rome, and they stopped numerous places, and he wrote different letters. One of the letters he wrote to the Smyrnians, and I'm just going to quote just a sentence or two of it from here, but he's telling these people, this is his, and this is repeated throughout all the different people he was writing to. He says, "You must all follow the lead of the bishop, as Jesus Christ followed that of the Father. Follow the presbytery," which are other holy men, leaders. "You must all follow the lead of the bishop as Jesus Christ followed that of the Father. Follow the presbytery as you would the apostles. Reverence the deacons as you would God's commandment. Let no one do anything touching the church apart from the bishop." And so, and quote there. So he's basically saying that the bishops are the intermediaries between the people and God, the church. Just one other sentence here that caught my attention. The same section, same letter to the Smyrnians. He said that it is well to revere God and bishop. He who honors the bishop is honored by God. He who does anything without the knowledge of the bishop worships the devil. End quote. So you can see how even back in the very, very early days of the church that it was important for these church leaders that the hierarchy be established and people work through bishops and presbyters, and they didn't have priests per se then, but they called them, they eventually became deacons and people that celebrate the Eucharist. But when I've read one thing about the Reformation, and the point that I saw about the Reformation was that people like Martin Luther wanted to return the church to the early days of the church, where there were no intermediaries between the people and God. I'm not ever sure there was a time when that was the case. As you can see from people who are writing here, people who knew the bishop, knew the apostles. St. Ignatius knew, I think, St. Paul. He's writing to basically say that don't do anything without the bishops. And to me, that really kind of cements it, that the church, since the very, very early days of the church, has been very strict about the church being an intermediary between you and God. So to hear this priest on Easter Sunday say exactly the opposite, I thought that was interesting, and I was happy to hear it. The other thought that I had, just to include in this podcast here, was about another reading about some of the early church fathers. There was a period where there was St. Ignatius and St. Clement of Rome. They were the first early fathers. They were like the first century after Jesus, first century AD. What happened was the Roman Empire started persecuting Christians, and before they were converted to Christianity, there was a period about the 3rd century AD when they started becoming Christians themselves. There was a period where Christians were being persecuted relentlessly, and there were men, they called them apologists, but they were men who wrote to the Emperor of Rome asking for some relief, that they just be treated fairly. Now, for those of you that saw the movie The Gladiator with Russell Crowe, you might remember Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is a famous emperor renowned for his wisdom and many of the writings. Some people do nothing but study Marcus Aurelius. his son was Commodus. Commodus is the bad guy in the movie The Gladiator. But anyway, the thing I'm about to read to you is from an apologist, if you will, who wrote to Marcus Aurelius and Commodus and some of the other emperors at the time, begging them that they just do nothing more than treat Christians like they want to be treated themselves. So what was happening at the time was Christians were being accused by anonymous accusers. Someone could accuse a Christian of something, and then the mob would come and take away their home or their property, and more often than not, the person that accused the Christian of this or whatever would get the property or get the home or whatever. So they were being pursued really not so much because of their Christianity, but because they were easy targets. But the part I want to address or talk to you about real quick is by one of the apologists. His name is Autonomy. And Autonomy wrote this letter to Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. And what he's trying to do is address the different things that the Christians were accused of. One of them, surprisingly, was they were accused of being cannibals, was one thing. He addresses that. But also they were accused of being promiscuous. And I find this interesting because it is a pretty good description of what Christians were like back in, this was the 2nd century, now after Jesus Christ, 2nd and into the 3rd century. And he's describing to Marcus Aurelius and Commodus what Christians were like and that they were not promiscuous. But it really strikes me as over the top, at least not the way we would interpret Christianity now. He makes the point that sexual intercourse is only for the point of having children, and that they're not allowed to even look upon with passion upon another, even their wife. He says, "For as Scripture says, quote, he that shall look on a woman to lust after her hath already committed adultery with her in his heart." So even a wanton glance is considered adultery to the Christians at that point. He also says that they don't look upon women, even their wives, as sexual objects. Another quote here, "We consider them then as brothers and sisters and give them other names of kinship, and therefore we set great store by keeping their bodies free from violation and corruption. Our law says furthermore that if any man takes a second kiss for the motive of pleasure," and then goes into more sexual things, but even the second kiss, if it's taken for the purpose of pleasure, then it's wrong. We have been thus to be so precise about the kiss, or rather the salutation, since if any one of us was even in the least stirred to passion in thought thereby, by the kiss, God would set him outside eternal life, unquote. So that sounds pretty pretty severe. And one last thing he says here too is they're talking about you can't remarry. So whoever shall put away his wife, meaning divorce, Scripture says, and shall marry another, he committeth adultery. It does not allow for him to divorce the one who he first married and take another wife beside her. But it also says, one that robs himself of his first wife, even if she be dead, is a covert adulterer, thwarting the hand of God. For in the beginning God made one man and one woman, and destroying the unity of flesh that was meant for the propagation of the race. So even if you marry after your wife or husband is dead, it's also a bad thing. So I'm not sure how Marcus Aurelius took all this. History tells us that the Roman Empire eventually went from being a persecutor of Christians to being a Christian empire. And the person that's most responsible for that, it took a long period of time, but one of the most well-known people that did that was the Emperor Constantine the Great. And it said that he had a victory at something called the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. And prior to the battle, he apparently saw a vision in the sky of a Christian cross with the message, "In this sign, conquer." And that led him to adopt the Christian symbol, the cross, for his troops. And then after his victory, he attributed that success to God and gradually became a patron of the Christian religion. It's also Saint Constantine, he's called Saint Constantine. It's also Constantine the Great's mother, Helen, that apparently found the pieces of the true cross in Jerusalem. Now, all that's a whole long story, and how much of that you choose to believe, I don't know. I'm not sure much I believe. But she went and she established where supposedly Jesus Christ was crucified, and now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is built upon that spot. But there's plenty of people, if you go there, that will tell you that that's not the spot. And there's competing places, actually, for where Christ was buried even. So that's kind of a long story. But as I mentioned there, history does teach us that Rome was eventually converted to Christianity. So what's the point of all this? You're asking. I'm asking. What's the point of all? The point of all this is that it constantly, if you pay attention to what's going on, you'll hear things that may make you think. Now, I would have never thought twice about this kind of stuff a few years ago before I started this awakening process where I was listening to and questioning everything. You know, the priest could have said that at Mass and I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But, you know, for him to say something which I think is directly contradictory to what the early church, the current church believes, it makes me wake up now and think, who really knows? Who really knows what's going on right now? And I don't believe I need a mediator right now between myself and God, however I define God for myself. And I still believe in Jesus Christ. But I don't think I need the intermediary piece of the Catholic Church to do that for me. But again, I have no battle with the Church itself. But I just wanted to show you that, you know, since the very beginning, the Catholic Church has always been about following the hierarchy and doing, you know, only what the bishops allow you to do until Martin Luther broke in the 16th century and started the Protestant Reformation. Anyway, that's plenty for today, and I usually don't like to read that much stuff. But thank you for listening. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review, that'd be awesome. But again, you can reach me at mike@mikenicholas.com if you have any comments, or just go to my website, mikenicholas.com, and you can leave a message there for me. Thank you. Bye-bye.